When we imagine a medieval battle, our minds often betray us with scenes straight out of a Hollywood blockbuster. Knights in gleaming armor charging at a gallop, swords clashing in perfectly choreographed duels, and armies marching in impeccable rows while an epic soundtrack thunders in the background. It's a captivating image, but about as accurate as a minstrel claiming he defeated a dragon in single combat. The reality of medieval warfare, spanning roughly from the 5th to the 15th century, was far removed from cinematic glory. It was a brutal, chaotic, and often downright miserable affair, filled with mud, blood, and a bone-deep exhaustion that made you wish you'd chosen a quieter trade, like basket weaving or tending goats. Medieval soldiers, often peasants or craftsmen torn from their everyday lives, didn't fight for epic montages but to survive, secure loot, or, with luck, please a lord who didn't even know their name. Let's dismantle the myths and dive into the gritty truth of how these soldiers fought, from the shield walls of Hastings to the arrow-strewn fields of Agincourt, exploring their weapons, tactics, logistics, and the human struggle that defined warfare in this era. The first thing to understand is who these soldiers were, because Hollywood's obsession with knights paints a distorted picture. Knights were the elite, the rock stars of the battlefield, but they made up a tiny fraction of any army. The majority were common folk, peasants, laborers, or local militias dragged into service by feudal obligations, promises of plunder, or the threat of an angry lord. They weren't professional warriors trained from the cradle like some medieval special forces. Many were farmers who, a week earlier, were more worried about their crops than dodging arrows. Their gear reflected their status: a spear if they were lucky, a dented helmet that doubled as a cooking pot, and perhaps a padded jacket called a gambeson that offered decent protection against a sword slash but little against a mace swung with bad intentions. Full-plate armor, the kind we see in movies shining like a freshly waxed car, was a luxury reserved for wealthy nobles and high-ranking knights. The average foot soldier might, at best, have a rusty mail shirt or a leather tunic that smelled like it had been stored in a damp barn for a decade. Medieval armies were a patchwork of backgrounds and skill levels. In the early Middle Ages, like during the Battle of Hastings in 1066, you'd find a mix of professional retainers, conscripted peasants, and mercenaries who'd fight for anyone with enough coin. By the late Middle Ages, during the 100 Years' War, armies grew more specialized, with dedicated archers, crossbowmen, and even primitive gunners, but the core remained the same: ordinary men thrust into extraordinary violence. These soldiers weren't exactly thrilled to be there. Imagine being told to leave your farm, grab a pointy stick, and march for weeks to fight a lord's rival over a border dispute or a sarcastic remark at a banquet. Desertion was a constant problem, and commanders used a mix of incentives: promises of land, money, or divine favor, and punishments, like hanging or worse, to keep their troops in line. The feudal system meant lords summoned their vassals, who in turn brought their own men, creating a chaotic army where loyalty was fragile and coordination a logistical nightmare. Now, let's talk about battles, because this is where Hollywood takes the most liberties. Movies show armies lined up in perfect rows, charging in unison like they've rehearsed for a military parade. In reality, coordinating a medieval army was like trying to organize a flash mob during a blackout. Communication relied on shouts, horn blasts, drums, or waved banners, which worked fine until the wind drowned out the horns or someone mistook the banner for a retreat signal. Take the Battle of Hastings in 1066, where William the Conqueror faced Harold Godwinson's Anglo-Saxons. The Anglo-Saxons formed a shield wall on a hill, a defensive line of men shoulder to shoulder, shields interlocked, and spears bristling. It sounds impressive, and it was, but it wasn't a polished spectacle. The men were tired, muddy, and probably cursing the English weather, which, as always, was wet and miserable. The Normans, with their mix of infantry, archers, and cavalry, tried to break this wall with repeated attacks, but it was less a choreographed assault and more a desperate, exhausting slog. Cavalry charges, so majestic in films, were risky and often ineffective against a well-formed shield wall. Horses aren't tanks. They spook at loud noises, tire quickly, and get stuck in mud like a car in a swamp. Many Norman knights ended up fighting on foot, not exactly the glorious charge they envisioned while polishing their armor that morning. Cavalry is one of the biggest myths of medieval warfare. Hollywood loves showing knights galloping across fields, lances leveled, sweeping enemies away like a tide. In reality, cavalry was a specialized, expensive tool, not the default strategy. A warhorse was a massive investment, costing as much as a small village, and keeping it fed and healthy on campaign was a logistical nightmare. A fully armored knight, weighing over 200 pounds with gear, needed a horse strong enough to carry that load without collapsing. If the terrain was bad, like the muddy fields of Agincourt in 1415, a cavalry charge could turn into a disaster. At Agincourt, French knights, weighed down by heavy plate armor, got bogged down in a quagmire, becoming easy targets for English archers and infantry. Horses slipped, knights fell, and what was supposed to be a glorious charge became a deadly game of knight-crushing for the English, who finished off stranded nobles with daggers, maces, or whatever was at hand. The lesson: a knight on horseback was fearsome, but only if the conditions were right. Mud, pikes, or a well-placed spear could turn a proud rider into a heavy liability. Archers were another critical component, and here Hollywood gets it half right but misses the big picture. Films love showing a lone archer picking off enemies with surgical precision, like a medieval sniper. The English longbow, star of battles like Crécy, 1346, and Agincourt, was a devastating weapon, but it wasn't about precision. Longbowmen were trained to fire in volleys, launching hundreds of arrows in seconds to create a deadly storm. A skilled archer could loose 10 to 12 arrows a minute, and with hundreds firing at once, the sky darkened with projectiles. These arrows weren't always aimed at specific targets. Their purpose was to disrupt, wound, and demoralize. A longbow arrow could pierce mail at close range or pin a knight's arm to his shield, but its real power was psychological. Imagine standing in a formation, hearing the whistle of incoming arrows, and knowing there's nowhere to hide. At Agincourt, the French learned this the hard way, as wave after wave of arrows turned their advance into chaos. Archers weren't noble heroes. They were often commoners, trained from childhood to build the strength needed to draw a 100 to 150 pound bow. Their arms were like tree trunks, and their job was to keep shooting until their arrows ran out or their shoulders gave up. Crossbows were another ranged weapon, especially popular in continental Europe. Unlike the longbow, which required years of training, a crossbow could be used by almost anyone with a few hours of practice. It was slower to reload, sometimes taking a minute to crank the string, but its bolts could pierce armor at close range. Crossbowmen were often mercenaries, like the Genoese hired by the French at Crécy. Unfortunately for them, their crossbows got wet in the rain, and their slow rate of fire made them easy targets for faster-firing English archers. The lesson: medieval warfare depended as much on luck and weather as on skill. A sudden rain could ruin your day as much as an enemy sword. Let's talk about weapons, because Hollywood's obsession with swords is one of its biggest distortions. In every medieval movie, the hero wields a gleaming long sword, twirling it like a baton in a perfectly choreographed duel. In reality, swords weren't the primary weapon for most soldiers. A good sword was expensive, hard to forge, and required constant maintenance to keep it from rusting or dulling. For the average soldier, a spear was the go-to weapon. It was cheap, easy to produce, and effective at keeping enemies at a distance. A spearman could jab a knight's horse or hold off an advancing enemy without needing years of fencing lessons. Maces, flails, and warhammers were also popular, especially against armored opponents. A mace didn't need to be sharp to crush a helmet or break ribs through mail, and it was easier to wield in a crowded melee than a sword, which could get stuck in a shield or dull against armor. Flails, with their chained heads, were tricky to use but could wrap around a shield or deliver a bone-shattering blow. Warhammers, with a spiked end for piercing and a blunt end for smashing, were a knight's nightmare, capable of denting plate armor or knocking a man out cold. Combat itself was far from the elegant duels of cinema. Picture a medieval battle like a packed concert where everyone's armed and nobody's happy. Soldiers were crammed together, shoving, stabbing, and swinging whatever they had. Visibility was awful, especially if you wore a visored helmet, which reduced your field of view to a narrow slit and made you sweat like you were in a portable sauna. Armies didn't stay in neat lines for long. Once formations clashed, it became a chaotic brawl. You might not see the guy stabbing you, and friendly fire was a real risk. A knight in full armor might feel invincible, but a well-placed dagger in the armpit or a mace to the knee could end his day. Exhaustion was a major factor. Swinging a weapon while wearing 40 to 60 pounds of armor was like running a marathon in a weighted vest. Most battles lasted only a few hours, but actual combat was so intense that soldiers were often gasping after minutes of hand-to-hand fighting. Chronicles from the time describe men collapsing from fatigue, weapons slipping from sweaty hands, and commanders struggling to keep their lines from dissolving into chaos. Sieges were a huge part of medieval warfare, and here Hollywood really misses the mark. Movies love dramatic assaults with catapults launching fireballs and soldiers scaling walls in perfect sync. In reality, sieges were long, boring, and downright disgusting. The goal was usually to starve out the defenders rather than storm the castle. A besieging army would surround a fortress, cut off its supplies, and wait for the defenders to run out of food, water, or hope. The siege of Rochester Castle in 1215, for example, lasted 7 weeks, with King John's forces trying everything from tunneling under the walls to lobbing rotting animal carcasses to spread disease. Catapults and trebuchets existed, but they weren't the flame-throwing machines of cinema. A trebuchet could hurl a 100-pound rock, but hitting a specific target was more luck than precision, and building one on-site took days or weeks. Defenders fought back with arrows, boiling oil, though not as common as movies suggest, or just chucking rocks at anyone dumb enough to get close to the walls. Disease was a bigger killer than combat in most sieges, as cramped conditions and poor hygiene turned camps into breeding grounds for dysentery and worse. Defenders inside the castle weren't much better off, often resorting to eating rats or leather to survive. Logistics was the unsung hero or villain of medieval warfare. Feeding an army of thousands was a nightmare without modern supply chains. Armies relied on ox-drawn carts, looting local villages, or whatever they could carry. Horses, especially the massive destriers used by knights, needed huge amounts of fodder, and a long campaign could leave them starving. The Black Prince's chevauchés during the 100 Years' War were as much about looting food and supplies as fighting. Bad weather, muddy roads, or a single broken bridge could derail an entire campaign. Disease was another constant threat. A medieval army camp was a petri dish for infections, and more soldiers died from illness than enemy swords. During the Siege of Calais in 1346–47, both sides suffered more from dysentery and malnutrition than actual combat. Keeping an army fed, healthy, and mobile was a Herculean task, and many campaigns failed not from battlefield defeat but because supply lines collapsed or men fell sick. Morale was as critical as weapons or numbers. Hollywood loves its pre-battle speeches, with kings inspiring their men to fight for honor and glory. In reality, most soldiers were terrified. Promises of loot, land, or divine favor kept them in line, but so did the threat of punishment. Desertion was a constant issue, and commanders didn't hesitate to execute stragglers to set an example. At the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, the French army collapsed partly because their morale broke under a hail of English arrows and poor leadership. Once an army started fleeing, it was nearly impossible to regroup. Chasing down a retreating enemy was often the deadliest part of a battle, as fleeing soldiers were cut down without resistance. Chronicles describe scenes of panic, with men trampling each other to escape or tossing weapons in surrender, only to be slaughtered anyway. Training varied widely. Knights spent years learning to fight on horseback and wield lances, often through tournaments that were as much about showing off as practicing. These tournaments, by the way, weren't just fun and games. They were brutal, sometimes deadly, and a way to hone skills without starting a war. But for the average soldier, training was minimal. Peasants might get a crash course on how to use a spear en route to battle, and archers needed some practice to build strength for a longbow, but most learned on the job. This lack of training made discipline hard to maintain. At the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, the English army's lack of cohesion let the smaller Scottish force, led by Robert Bruce, exploit the terrain and score a stunning victory. The Scots used schiltrons, tight formations of spearmen, to repel English cavalry, proving brains could beat brawn if you played your cards right. The English, stuck in swampy terrain, couldn't adapt, and their knights were picked off like flies in honey. Naval warfare, though less common, was just as chaotic. Movies show massive galleons blasting cannons, but cannons were rare until the late Middle Ages. At the Battle of Sluys in 1340, ships were basically floating platforms for land-style fighting. Archers fired from decks, soldiers boarded enemy ships, and the fighting was as brutal as on land. Falling overboard was a death sentence for most, as few medieval soldiers could swim. The sea added its own challenges. Waves could throw off aim, ships could catch fire, and a sudden storm could sink an entire fleet. The French fleet at Sluys was decimated when the English caught them in a narrow channel, turning the battle into a slaughter as ships were boarded and crews hacked apart. Women, though rarely shown in combat roles, weren't absent from medieval warfare. During sieges, they often helped defend castles, carrying supplies, tending the wounded, or even fighting. Joan of Arc is the famous example, leading French troops in the 100 Years' War, but she wasn't alone. At the Siege of Hennebont in 1342, Joanna of Flanders rallied defenders and, according to chronicles, even hurled torches at enemy siege engines, earning the nickname Joanna the Flame. Women also served as spies, messengers, or camp followers, crucial but rarely celebrated roles. They faced the same dangers as men, from starvation to enemy attacks, and their contributions were vital to many campaigns. Tactics evolved over the Middle Ages. Early battles relied on brute force and simple formations like the shield wall, where men held together and hoped the enemy broke first. Later, commanders like Edward III used combined arms, archers, infantry, and cavalry working together, with devastating effect. The Mongols, though outside the European context, influenced tactics with their hit-and-run strategies and feigned retreats, which European armies occasionally adopted. Cunning was key. Ambushes, fake retreats, and night attacks could turn the tide. At the Battle of Nicopolis in 1396, Crusader arrogance led them into an Ottoman trap, where light cavalry lured them into a kill zone. The Crusaders, expecting an easy win, were surrounded and slaughtered, a reminder that hubris was as deadly as any sword. The psychological toll of warfare was immense. Medieval soldiers had no therapists, and the horrors of battle, severed limbs, screaming horses, the stench of blood, left lasting scars. Superstitions abounded. A strange cloud, a bird flying the wrong way, or a weird dream could be seen as a bad omen, shattering morale. Religious fervor, especially during the Crusades, drove some to fight with reckless abandon, believing death in battle guaranteed heaven. But fear was universal, and even the bravest knight could crack under constant danger. Chronicles describe men weeping before battle, praying to survive, or frozen in terror as the enemy charged. The church played a big role, with priests blessing armies and promising salvation, but even divine promises couldn't always overcome the raw fear of a spear coming at your face. The arrival of gunpowder in the 14th and 15th centuries began to change the game. Early cannons were clumsy and unreliable, but by the fall of Constantinople in 1453, Ottoman artillery toppled walls that had stood for centuries. Handheld firearms, like the arquebus, were still rare but signaled the knight's decline. Yet the core of medieval warfare, grueling, chaotic, and deeply human, remained until the Renaissance. Battles like Toten in 1461, one of the bloodiest in the Wars of the Roses, showed that even late in the period, warfare was a brutal slog, with thousands dying in a single day of hacking and slashing in the snow. Let's dive into some specific battles to grasp the chaos. The Battle of Toten, fought during a blizzard in 1461, was a brutal clash between Yorkists and Lancastrians. Up to 50,000 men fought in freezing conditions, with visibility so poor that soldiers sometimes attacked their own side. Yorkist archers had the wind at their backs, giving their arrows extra range, while Lancastrians struggled to respond. When the lines met, it was carnage, with men wielding poleaxes, swords, and maces in desperate hand-to-hand combat. The ground turned to bloody mud, and the fighting lasted hours until the Lancastrians broke and fled, only to be cut down or drowned in nearby rivers. Estimates suggest 20,000 to 28,000 died, making it one of England's deadliest days. No Hollywood glory here, just men fighting to survive in a frozen hell. Another example is the Battle of Grunwald in 1410, where the Polish-Lithuanian alliance faced the Teutonic Knights. The Teutons, with their disciplined heavy cavalry, were the medieval equivalent of a pro sports team but were outmaneuvered by a larger, less polished force. The Polish-Lithuanians used light cavalry to harass the knights, luring them into unfavorable terrain, then overwhelmed them with numbers. The battle wasn't a clean victory. It was a grueling, bloody mess, with thousands dead on both sides. The Teutons' reputation took a hit, proving even elite warriors could fall to clever tactics and stubborn resilience. The Crusades offer another window into medieval warfare's reality. The First Crusade, 1096 to 1099, was less a triumphal march and more a desperate slog through hostile territory. Crusaders faced starvation, disease, and constant ambushes by Seljuk Turks, who used light cavalry to pick off stragglers. The siege of Antioch in 1097–98 was brutal, with Crusaders nearly starving before taking the city. When they finally broke through, it wasn't a heroic charge but a sneaky betrayal by a defender who let them in. The ensuing massacre of the city's inhabitants was less about chivalry and more about pent-up frustration and survival. The Crusades weren't just knightly heroism. They were a brutal mix of faith, greed, and desperation, with soldiers enduring horrors no movie would dare depict. Weapon technology evolved slowly but had a big impact. Early medieval soldiers relied on simple iron weapons, spears, axes, and short swords. By the 14th century, advances in metallurgy allowed stronger armor and weapons like the two-handed long sword and poleaxe, a versatile weapon with a spike, hammer, and blade. Crossbows became more common, and plate armor made knights harder to kill, though slower and vulnerable to blunt weapons or grappling. The longbow, as mentioned, was a game-changer for the English but required specialized training. Gunpowder weapons, starting with crude cannons in the 14th century, were initially more about noise and intimidation than accuracy, but by 1453, they were decisive in battles like Constantinople. Armor deserves its own discussion, because Hollywood loves portraying knights as invincible tanks. Early medieval armor was often just chain mail, hauberk, flexible but heavy at 20 to 40 pounds. It could stop a sword slash but was less effective against thrusts or blunt weapons. By the 13th century, knights added metal plates to key areas, leading to full plate armor by the 15th century. Contrary to myth, plate wasn't unbearably heavy, typically 30 to 50 pounds, well distributed, and a fit knight could run, climb, or even do cartwheels in it. But it was exhausting to wear for hours, especially in heat. The downside? It was expensive, so only the rich could afford it, and it didn't make you invulnerable. A crossbow bolt at close range or a well-aimed warhammer could ruin your day. For the average soldier, a gambeson or leather armor was the best they could hope for, offering some protection but leaving them exposed to serious blows. Camp life was another grim reality. Movies rarely show the time between battles, but it was a huge part of a soldier's life. Armies spent more time marching and camping than fighting. A typical camp was a sprawling, filthy mess, with men sleeping in tents or under the stars, eating whatever they could find. Often moldy bread, thin stew, or stolen livestock. Hygiene was non-existent, leading to outbreaks of dysentery, typhus, and plague. The Black Death in the 1340s hit armies hard, sometimes wiping out units before they saw combat. Camp followers, cooks, blacksmiths, prostitutes, and families added to the chaos. Discipline was lax, and fights over food, loot, or grudges were common. A soldier's life was as much about surviving the camp as the battlefield. Religion played a massive role. The church was a major player, blessing armies and promising salvation for those who died in just wars, especially the Crusades. Priests often accompanied armies, holding mass and absolving sins. This could boost morale but also led to fanaticism, with soldiers taking risks they'd otherwise avoid. During the People's Crusade in 1096, a disorganized mob of peasants marched to the Holy Land, convinced God would protect them. They were wrong, and most were slaughtered by Turkish forces. Superstitions also loomed large. A comet, eclipse, or odd animal could be seen as a bad omen, causing panic. Commanders had to manage these fears, often using religious symbols like relics or banners to rally their men. Mercenaries grew more common, especially in the late Middle Ages. Companies like the White Company in 14th century Italy were professional soldiers for hire, bringing discipline and skill but also a reputation for brutality and greed. They could turn a battle but were just as likely to switch sides if the money dried up. Their presence added complexity, as commanders had to balance loyalty, cost, and reliability. The end of the Middle Ages saw the decline of traditional medieval warfare. The rise of professional standing armies, gunpowder weapons, and centralized states shifted the balance. By the Battle of Castillon in 1453, French artillery decimated English forces, signaling the night's end. But even in these late battles, the core of medieval warfare, grueling, chaotic, and deeply human, remained. Soldiers fought not for abstract ideals but for survival, loyalty, or the hope of a better life. The next time you see a knight slicing through enemies like a superhero in a movie, remember the truth. Medieval warfare was a dirty, desperate struggle, where victory often went to the side that could endure the chaos just a little longer.